Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those in-house, we need to check our cell phones and other mobile devices to make sure they've been turned off. For those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we post the program on the homepage following today's presentation for everyone else's reference as well. Welcoming our guest is Thomas Spore. He is director of our Center for National Defense and the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy. Before joining us here last year, he served for over 36 years in the U.S. Army and attained the rank of Lieutenant General. He has served numerous military assignments, including Director of the Army Office of Business Transformation in the Office of the Undersecretary of the Army, Director of Program Analysis and Evaluation at the Headquarters of the Army, Deputy Commanding General for support with the U.S. forces in Iraq, and many others. Please join me in welcoming General Spore.
Well, good afternoon, folks. Thanks for joining us today as we hear about a really important topic. And it was President Lincoln in his second inaugural address who provided us what I think is the clearest statement on what we owe our veterans, and that is to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphan. It could be that America has the most comprehensive system of care for veterans in the world, and yet even with that system, it often falls short of need, and therefore there is an extraordinary need for expert advice in the field of philanthropy for veterans in order to ensure that every dollar goes to a valid need. I think some of us probably remember the news stories a couple years ago about the Wounded Warrior Project, where come to find out some of the money they had raised was going to sponsor conferences and the like at places like Las Vegas. It's organizations like the Philanthropy Roundtable and our guest today, Thomas Meyer, who have played a vital role in advising both charities and philanthropists in this endeavor. His new book, Uniformed Champions, looks at a dozen cases of philanthropists who are making a difference in veterans' lives and filling the gap left by our government. It's based on real organizations and real experiences. Thomas Meyer is an experienced professional in this field. He directs veteran services at the Philanthropy Roundtable, having served there since 2012. His work focuses on developing strategies for philanthropists seeking to initiate or increase effective giving in the Veterans Services field. Thomas is also co-founder of the Independence Project, an effort to help veterans with disabilities overcome challenges and bad incentives to find meaningful and rewarding work in civilian life. Prior to joining the Roundtable, Thomas completed a Fox Fellowship at the University of Cambridge, where he conducted research on junior military officer decision-making in counterinsurgencies. He holds a degree in sociology from Yale University, grew up as an Army brat, living in 6 countries over 14 years. I can say Army brat because I'm an Army veteran. Some people find offense to it, some people welcome the phrase. Please join me in welcoming Thomas Meyer.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I very much embrace the title of Army brat because for most of my childhood, I was exactly that. Okay, so this book is a strange one. It's not one that I ever expected to write before I came to the Roundtable. It's frankly an area of American civil society that I didn't know existed until I started working at the Roundtable. Because in a lot of ways, we sort of assume that the government is the one that takes care of all things veteran-related. But as General Spore mentioned just a couple seconds ago, over the last probably 10 years or so, I think a lot of Americans and philanthropists have really come to realize that that's not good enough, that there are not only things that aren't covered by government, but there are things that are sort of counterproductive or that are being, and were especially 10 years ago, being run poorly. So what I'm going to do right now is sort of give you a quick overview of three things that I learned from writing these case studies, all 12 of them with some really wonderful donors and foundations in the country. I'm going to give you an overview of three things that I think veterans need from the U.S. And then I'm going to make a quick case for why philanthropy ought to be invested in this area, because I think it's something that is worth spending a little bit of time on. And then I think we'll go to questions and then hopefully have a conversation with the general up here. So number one, most important, if you take nothing else away from this time here together, the one thing I would like you to think about is that we need to give veterans the right narrative. Right now, we have a culture that, for various reasons, is sort of distant from the post 9/11 veteran population, and that looks at it in one of two ways, or sometimes in a combined way of the two. But it's either as hero or victim, or, as I mentioned, sometimes broken hero, but nothing really in between. And so, sort of, I can understand why a lot of Americans see this. I mean, we see reporting on some of the most wonderfully heroic things that our men and women in uniform have done overseas on behalf of the rest of us, and that's truly worth being proud of as a country and worth sort of lauding. And then we also see a lot the sort of catastrophic injuries that people are surviving now that they never would have in the past. And it's important to focus on those and to realize that those cases deserve special attention and special support. But what we lose in focusing on sort of these edge cases is the big middle, right? The folks who served the country, who sort of did their time, and who come back to a society and have to put together a life after they serve. They're not in either of these extreme categories. They're folks who have to go through transition. And as any of us knows, who've had to move geographically, who've had to change jobs, who've had major family changes, transition is difficult. And so if we forget, the middle 98% of veterans, then we're really doing a disservice to all of them. So my one hope for you is that you sort of take away from this that veterans really read the right narrative, one that sort of goes somewhere between them being irredeemably broken and sort of unapproachably heroic. There's good evidence that shows that veterans on the front end, when they come into the military, are on average a little bit healthier, a little bit better educated, and certainly less criminal than their civilian counterparts, the ones who didn't serve. And on the back end, when they get out, they tend to vote in higher rates, they tend to volunteer in higher rates, and so we should really be thinking about these folks as not as liabilities or risks to manage, but as opportunities and assets for our communities and for some of the biggest problems facing the country. I think this is something that's bled into the national conversation more and more, thankfully. But I'll tell quickly the story of a foundation that's done a really fantastic job of putting their money where their mouth is. It's the Hinds Endowments, a big foundation out in Western Pennsylvania, associated with the ketchup company. Wanted to support veterans, but they couldn't figure out why in Pittsburgh a large number of veterans nonprofits were struggling to find veterans to serve. Saying, gosh, where are all the homeless veterans? Where are the veterans who are, drug addicted and on the street and, who need us? And they got a really smart program officer in there who served in Iraq. She was a West Point grad. And she sort of looked around and said, we're missing the folks like me who are getting out of the military. And no, we're not homeless, we're not drug addicted, we're not in crisis, but we feel lost. We don't know what we want to do with our lives. We know that we had something that was really meaningful and now we don't. And yeah, I can see for some of us, if it keeps going down that path, we may end up homeless, we may end up in a bad situation, but why don't we invest in something that hits a little bit early on? Why don't we invest in something that treats these folks like they have potential? And so they crafted this really amazing portfolio of organizations, including bringing some in from out of state and from around the country, that do things like recruit veterans to complete service projects in some of the worst blighted neighborhoods of Pittsburgh, or to go through leadership training to get them involved and engaged in nonprofits doing really important work in Pittsburgh. And so in sort of looking at veterans as a solution to some of their problems, one, they helped out the other portfolios at the foundation, but two, they started finding that the veterans who participated in this, while they were attracted by the idea of giving back, were also themselves going through some struggle of, whether it's looking for a better job or having some, emotional and behavioral challenges, and going through these programs made it better for them and easier for them to go and seek help where they needed it. And so I think that really sort of hits on the importance of getting the narrative right, because once you get the narrative right, then you can start to, in their case, fund, but in the rest of our cases, whatever we do in our daily lives that intersect with veterans, that we can get that right too. So that's point number one. If you need to walk out the room and forget you are here today, don't forget that piece. Piece number two is the right incentives. I think this follows actually pretty closely from number one. For the majority of these recent wars, the nation's response to veterans has been, thank you for your service, here is stuff. Whether you're talking about government programs or whether you're talking about nonprofits giving away things like, tickets to baseball games and houses and vacations. And in some cases, that's really helpful and necessary for folks who are, have disabilities that limit their mobility or who really make it difficult for them to do anything without these sort of specially designed assets. But again, for the majority of folks, we have designed both a public and, to a large extent, a nonprofit system that rewards veterans and encourages veterans not to go out and find whatever's next for them in life, not to go out and become engaged in whatever community they go back to, not to complete rounds of treatment at medical centers for conditions that they really have and ought to be working on. It's sort of most concretely distilled in the VA disability compensation system. About 100 years old. It hasn't been updated since 1947. But the system that basically says, look, we'll pay you for your disabilities. Great intent, but in practice, it does the exact opposite. Right? It pays people to be disabled, and it punishes them when they try to recover. So we turn around, we look at veterans, and we ask, gosh, why are 45% of today's veterans applying for disability compensation? Why are there so many veterans that we see with PTSD and with other struggles? And it's, well, we've created an incentive system that promotes it. And I want to be really clear about something here. This is not to say in any way that veterans are making unethical decisions because they're bad people. They're not making immoral decisions. They're responding to the incentives that we as the country have put in front of them. We as nonprofits, in a lot of cases, have put in front of them. And so it's really our fault as a country if we give them the wrong incentives and then turn around and wonder why we have a labor force participation rate for young veterans that's on a multi-low. That we wonder why we have skyrocketing post-traumatic stress disorder rates. To get to the sort of optimistic philanthropy angle of this, a project I work on with a number of wonderful donors, including the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation, the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, the Anschutz Foundation, and others. We looked at the system that incentivizes veterans in exactly the wrong way. We said, if we instead focused our efforts on an outcome rather than an output, right? The current disability system focuses on output. How much do we pay you for your injury? If we instead said our goal here is for veterans to, like the rest of us, find health and to find success, what would a system that promotes that look like? And so that's the genesis of the Independence Project, a program that links up with veterans soon after they transition and that says to them, okay, we recognize your disability. We want you to seek treatment for it. We want you to overcome it. What do we need to do? How can we coach you? How can we incentivize you? How can we support you through this time of need so that you launch into a career and into a life that you find valuable, that you find dignity, and that you find purpose in? That's not something that can happen outside of the nonprofit realm at this point. And so we're really grateful to be able to work with folks. And we're not the only ones who are working on improving incentives for veterans. I think a lot of folks, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, a lot of the best nonprofits working in this area give veterans support and then expect something from them, expect them to give back. And so that kind of mentality, driven from that kind of narrative that we talked about earlier, is really critical, and it's something that nonprofits and philanthropies are leading the way on. Last, I'll focus on something that's a little bit more sort of nerdy, and I will say I'm not the nerdy one. I work with plenty of smarter people who are the nerdy ones, but we need the right information for veterans. One of my favorite examples of the wrong information is the veteran unemployment rate. It seems pretty great right now. I mean, it's been sort of fluctuating up and down the last few months, but it's on sort of a low over the last, compared to sort of the last decade or so. But that number is based on, as Dan Goldenberg, the head of the Call of Duty Endowment, a big funder of veteran employment work, says it's based on a simple question, which is, did you do any work for pay last week? Okay, so that could mean, showing up and working here and having a full-time job and being able to support your family. Or it could mean somebody paid you $20 to, mow their grass, and you're actually really struggling and you need a better job and you need to get food on the table for your family. This is the kind of information that not only the government, but nonprofits and philanthropists have to work with when it comes to understanding the well-being of veterans. And frankly, it's insufficient. The funder I mentioned earlier, the Call of Duty Endowment, in the face of this bad information, said, we have a group of about 10 organizations that are focused entirely on getting veterans great jobs. What if we started looking at them and the demand for their services, not as a perfect measure for the employment situation of vets, but as something that can give us at least a little bit of nuance and color to add to this very simple question that the Bureau of Labor Statistics sort of reports on veterans, that was never really meant to be an indicator of veteran success. And so they polled their nonprofits, their whole portfolio, they brought them together and said, what does demand look like sort of from today compared to last year? And these groups serve over 20,000 veterans a year. I mean, just a huge number. And the organization said, we have an increase in demand of 25% over the same quarter last year. That's a hugely different story. And so sort of point one of having the right information is that we need better statistics and indicators of what's going on with the veteran population. Two, we need programs to focus on, and this is public and private again, we need programs to focus on whether they're working or not. I think a lot of well-intentioned not-for-profits started up in the last 10 years to support veterans that had sort of the line of logic, I enjoy doing this hobby in my life. I bet veterans share that, and why don't I give that experience to them, and maybe it will help them with their transition. Again, great intention, but it also meant that we had a ballooning of nonprofits that almost sort of suggested to be treatments for different conditions, but that had no evidence behind them. And so you have people going through it whose lives are maybe temporarily or not at all changed. And then you have donors who are putting money towards it who have no sense of whether the money's working. To go back to employment a little bit, even the government struggles with this. The last time that they released information about how much it cost to put veterans in a job, it was somewhere, I think, around $3,000 a piece. They don't measure it all that often. They don't know how long people stayed in those jobs. They don't know the quality of those jobs. Really very little information about how effective it was. The donor I mentioned earlier, the Call of Duty Endowment, they can tell you on a quarterly basis how many people their organizations put into jobs, what it cost them to put into jobs, and by the way, it was about a fifth of the cost of the government programs, what the folks who got into those jobs made. I can't remember if I mentioned how long they stayed in those jobs, and then whether those jobs were full-time or part-time, right? So a lot more sort of actionable information. The second example there, I think worth bearing in mind is Cohen Veterans Network, a network of about 24 or will be 24 private clinics around the country focused on veteran and military family and veteran family mental and behavioral health care. So they provide free care to anyone sort of in kind of the larger military and veteran family. And initially they started out expecting to see a lot of PTSD cases, right? That's sort of what we hear a lot in the news, and that's what is most common to sort of perceive veterans as having. But what they realized is that about 80% of what they see falls into the other category, right? It's family strain from coming back from deployment or from separating from the military. It's grief, it's anxiety, it's depression, it's identity issues, right? Just who am I now that I no longer have the uniform? And so it's really important, again, as an indicator to better understand what's going on with the veteran population and to say, these folks aren't broken, they're not experiencing things that permanently sort of disable them from participating in society. They're going through transition, and we can help them through that. And of course, as being medical providers, they also are very rigorous about doing outcome measures and making sure that they are effective and efficacious in their treatment. And so I think looking at these, and I just gave you, maybe a third or a half of the short versions of the cases that we write about in the book. But I think looking at these, what's inspiring to me is seeing that while we have a long way to go to help veterans sort of be all that they can be in civilian life, there's some really wonderful sort of civil society groups that are working on this, that are helping to make progress. So 2 quick things, then I'll shut up and we can get to questions. Philanthropy is, the cases in the book, if you add them all up together and sort of make a generous estimate of what they sum up to, it's about $120 million in the year that I gathered this information. In that same year, the VA's budget was about $160 billion, right? So philanthropy is the philanthropy in this book, not all of it, but some of the biggest ones are in this book. It's about 0.07% of the federal VA budget. So you think, what could you possibly accomplish with that? It's tiny. It's budget dust. Why spending so much on that? Well, considering that we spend so much on that publicly, one, why do philanthropists think they can make a difference? And 2, why should they focus on it? And to that, I have a few answers. One is that the government can't provide everything that veterans, or I'd say society, needs most, right? Veterans, as I can't remember who said this, but veterans don't come back to government agencies, they come back to communities. And communities are the places where you find relationships, they're where you find meaning, they're where you find, as I think Sebastian Junger would say, where you find tribe. And that's just not something that the government is set up to do. They shouldn't be asked to do that, and we shouldn't blame them for not being able to do it. It is one of the great benefits of having a strong civil society. And so I think we need to remember that In a lot of ways, successful veteran reintegration is on us as people and getting to know our neighbors. Two, philanthropy, as you can tell from all the examples I gave earlier, is just way better at innovation and flexibility. The VA has a lot of really good doctors and wonderful professionals within it, but I sort of think of it as Gulliver and the Lilliputians, just being tied down in so many different ways that it's hard for them to shift course. It's a giant aircraft carrier, and it's hard to get it to turn. And so philanthropy can be this place where we explore new ideas, where we test new things, where we build evidence about what the best way to help veterans is, and the best way to help our country. These needs aren't going away. I've heard some funders say, okay, well, we're out of Afghanistan, so therefore, the war's done. We're good. We can go elsewhere. And the answer is, one, not so much. You guys in the National Security Program know that a lot better than I do. But two, that's sort of irrelevant. Every year, the military turns over probably about over 200,000 people. Every year, 1/5 of a million Americans are transitioning, going through a huge life change. And we can either take this wonderful set of assets and help them grow, or we can ignore them as civil society. And so I wouldn't say that this problem is not going away. I would say that this opportunity is going to remain indefinitely. And last, my sort of final plea for foundations, for Americans to get engaged in what's going on with veterans is that they're not an alien species. They are folks who are, in a lot of ways, going through the same challenges that the rest of America is, right? They're figuring out how to fit into a new gig economy and a new economy where automation is going at incredibly fast rates. They're struggling with the decline of social capital that the rest of us are struggling with. They're facing suicide and mental health and opioid conditions, just like the rest of Americans are. And so I think by focusing on them, not as a separate species, but as a sort of a vital part of kind of the thread of what makes America America, you kind of get a 2-for-1 benefit by really sort of caring for and investing in this population. So with that, I will quiet down, and we can either do questions from the audience now, or we can sit down.
Let's see if there's any questions from the audience here. Yes.
Lots of things hit me when you were going through this. The civil society aspect gives me the thought that, like many students who are going to college, and I'm thinking that you're dealing with a younger set of people because they've not made the military a lifelong career, they're in and out. Like many students going to college, they haven't really found the civil society route before they got there. They often go there presuming that's what they will gain somehow once there. Is there a failure in some ways for career development or training for these younger veterans in this day and time with the constant turnover? Because I remember the advertisings about not only how you could make the career or we'll train you in this type of thing and that, and now they seem to not be transitioning to that once they've gotten that training in the Corps itself. It's almost like they're just back in nowhere, or they got through college, yeah, I've got a degree in political science, now what am I going to do with it, type of thing, but didn't even come up with another track. Is there anything to that in this?
Yeah, and first of all, I will stick up for the social sciences and say my sociology degree is worth a lot to me. And okay, good. Yes, I think there are two pieces of this. One is the sort of figuring out who I am and where I belong piece of it, and one is the sort of career element. So we'll tackle the who I am and where I belong. I think a lot of people, and this is, you know, reflected in the evidence, people join the military. In a lot of cases, it's not their only option, as sort of popular narrative would say. People join it because they want to be a part of something that's bigger than themselves, and I think they do get that meaning and that sort of root while they're in the military. It's the fact that we don't transition it well afterwards, that we sort of just rip them out of that. And on one day they're in uniform, and on the next day, you know, they're being handed a disability form or an unemployment compensation form. And so I think some of the best organizations and frankly the ones that are growing most quickly right now are the ones who tap into the sort of providing that sense of meaning and belonging. So you look at organizations like Team Red, White, and Blue and the Mission Continues and Team Rubicon, all of whom have essentially the same sort of thesis, which is if we get veterans together after they leave the service and we give them something to do that either allows them to serve their community or allows them to live a healthy lifestyle, they'll flock to it. And they will create a community around it because it resonates deeply with what they joined the military to do, right? It sort of makes perfect sense. And that's exactly what's happened. I mean, you look at the response to Hurricane Harvey down in Houston. There's something like 500 veterans organized just by one organization down there. And they are, you know, helping with disaster relief and recovery and helping people put their lives back together because they are drawn to the same kind of meaning they found in the military. So, so that, to your first question, I think, you know, people join the military because they want that experience. When they're in the military, they have it, and it's fantastic in the vast majority of cases. And then when they leave, they got to find an opportunity to sort of reconnect with that, because it's not, you know, it's not something that that just sort of pops up naturally for civilian society. On the job training front, you know, I think one of the best benefits that maybe the best benefit that veterans get is the GI Bill, right? This investment in their future. There's a great reporting that's come out recently from the Student Veterans of America that basically shows this is a great investment for our country because veterans do better in college after they leave the military than their civilian, you know, 18 to 22-year-old counterparts are doing. And it's especially surprising because non-traditional students, folks who are a little bit older, tend to perform a lot worse than the 18 to 22-year-olds. But veterans are completely bucking that trend. So I think when veterans transition out, they are, a lot of them don't want to do the same thing that they were doing in the military. And so that makes this sort of natural transition from military truck driver to civilian truck driver not just difficult, but in some ways sort of not useful. So I think that there are some very good resources in terms of education. One of the things that I've seen a lot of the leading employment organizations focus on recently is helping veterans figure out what they want to do, not just getting them a job, but figuring out what's my calling, what's my purpose, what kind of career do I want to have. And I think, again, some nonprofits have, in setting up kind of almost career coaching programs, have started to crack the nut, but it's certainly not something that's planned into the transition process. I mean, as you all know, the DoD is a warfighting machine. That's what it's meant to do. And so I think in a lot of ways, they're still trying to figure out what the back end, what the transition out of service looks like.
That does hit what was going to be my kind of follow-up. Is there a problem in Tom having been in military and others? Is that the transitional problem? Can any of the philanthropy groups have access prior to that very last day of service to coach, mentor, pre-check them? Because obviously that's not what the military is supposed to be doing. They're not doing career counseling like a college. They have their career. And is there anything blocking that interface as opposed to them having to come out and then start on their own to try to find you and the philanthropy groups?
Sure. Yes, I'm really glad you brought that up. So, one of my favorite philanthropists is the Schultz family, the Starbucks fame. They have, working with an institute up at Syracuse University, come up with sort of a solution to exactly this problem. They're saying, look, none of us wait until, or we try not to, wait until we're out of a job to find our next job. We're usually kind of working on it before we put in our 2 weeks notice. In the military, there's no real way for that to happen, and actually because of restrictions about who's allowed to come on base and who's allowed to deliver programming on base, that's actually much harder. And so what the Schultz Foundation did was say, okay, we will work with bases, individual bases, to come up with these training programs that we get folks started up to 6 months before they transition out. And we'll have them sort of tracked into everything from customer service to IT to cybersecurity to manufacturing. And we're going to work with the very best training organizations in those fields, whether it's online training or in-person training. And we're going to get these folks ready so that as they move from the 6-month point to day 0, they're gaining basically the first credential they need to start in that career. And the expectation is that later on they go and they continue building their skills and their certifications, but they want to get them started on that. And so so they educate them, and then about 70% of the way through their education, they get linked up with basically sort of a career coaching, a career placement organization that starts to work with a select group of employers to say, hey, we've got this person who's going to come out with a certification in network management in X period of time. I know that you, Cisco, are looking for that. Let me put this person in front of you. Let me get you, an interview with them. And so they've really been pioneers in getting access to folks early and providing them with options. But I'll tell you, it took them a couple of years to get that done, and it's not something that is yet smooth.
Other questions? Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It seems to me that one of the major parts of civil society are religious organizations, churches, what have you. So I was wondering if you could comment at all about how good of a job you think they're doing at reaching out to veterans, as you were saying.
That's a great question, which I don't have a great answer for. I'll say that and I think part of the reason for that is that churches are among the most decentralized aspects of civil society, and that's part of why people find a lot of meaning in them and a lot of sort of personal connection to them. And so I think for that reason, there's no sort of centralized or large and scaling program for vets in churches. Or churchesforvets.org or something like that. So that's a long way of saying I don't have a great answer on you for that on you, but I would imagine that on a local level it would be something that sort of varies individually by church. There are some, and this is particularly in the Chicago area, funded by the McCormick Foundation, that look at something called moral injury. So the idea that going to war asks you to do things that are counter to your moral constitution. I'm not as well aware of that, but that's the only set of programs that I've heard kind of from a kind of national perspective. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi. Ariel DeJesus with the American Legion. I had a quick question, two of them actually. One of them, when you were going through your 3 points or three, excuse me, 3 steps, the right incentive, you talked a little bit about the VA disability instead of handling them a disability, or I don't know if I fell asleep to it all, or if I was just
I
writing too much.
apologize if I rambled.
Well, I want to know if you can kind of elaborate a little bit more on that portion. And then the other question was regarding um, the last topic you're talking about, the transitioning. Now, I know the Department of Labor has their transition assistance program, and I know it's mandated by Congress, I believe, that service members must attend one of those transition classes. It says 12 months or a year out prior to separation. I know the American Legion um, has a resolution out there. We'd like to see that these service members attend at least twice prior to them leaving. So again, like you said, so they could have somewhat of an understanding or foundation of what they want to do after military life. Um, that was just more of a comment. But if you can kind of go a little bit more regarding the disability portion or right incentive, that's what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say for the second one, I think you're exactly right. Putting it upstream is extremely important. I'd also say that the content, and again, I mean, I know TAP and transition assistance varies depending on where it's implemented. Yeah, you're nodding your head, you know this. But a lot of folks that I've talked to and that the organizations we work with have talked to said, you know, they helped me with a lot of the tactical stuff, putting together a resume, you know, learning how to fill out paperwork, et cetera. They didn't help me with the vision stuff. And so I think it's worth looking into sort of the content of that as well and helping people with the vision piece of it. And, you know, I imagine that, you know, the Legion is full of folks who have made, you know, you can't join unless you've made that transition. And so I wonder if, I imagine you guys are looking into this already, but, you know, how people go through that personal and professional journey to transition out and how that might be sort of turned into a program or made into something that you can present to parents. To jump back to the disability piece, yeah, so the way I look at it is starts from this perspective. I wouldn't want somebody operating on me surgically using the same technology that we had in 1947, right? I'd want them to at least take another look at it and say, okay, does this match with the best we know about the way the appendix works today, the best we know about how to sanitize surgical equipment, the best we know about how to do post-op care. And the same goes for the disability system. I think the same goes for GI Bill, for home loans, for any benefit. The current disability system has as lots of studies have shown, these sort of goals that are at loggerheads. On the one hand, and this is something that, you know, is, I think, absolutely core and important, and frankly probably why most people get on the disability system, is healthcare, right? You want to be covered for whatever is wrong and whatever happened in service, and you want to be able to seek treatment for it in the time that it affects your life. So on the one hand, that's positive. That's pushing people to get better. On the other hand, we have a system that, again, when it was designed initially in about 1918, but then updated in about 1947, the system says, okay, well, how did we break you, and what percentage are you broken? And we're going to look at this up on our standardized form and say, this is your rating. That, to go back to my earlier analogy, that model of disability was thrown out in, God, well before the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in the early 90s. What that act did was say, our job, with respect to people with disabilities is to help them mainstream, right? To do everything that we can to give them full function and to give them full opportunity and to give them full success that every other American has access to. And so my thinking is we need to take a look at this program, match it up against the best of what we know works. And you can actually, there are lots of examples from really, from a lot of Northern European countries, from the United Kingdom, who have looked at their own civilian disability systems and gone through major transitions over the last few years to change from their sort of legacy system to a system that reflects what we know best about sort of modern society. And the second piece that I'll say is that it's about end games and matching up strategies with end games. So my goal, what I believe the very best option for and the very best outcome for veterans is health and success, right? And success I'll put in terms of having, family sustaining work and meaning, right? Purpose, something you get up every morning for and say, all right, here's my identity as, for me, it's philanthropic advisor and sort of, for you guys, it's scholars and wonks. But what we have now is not only a system that doesn't help you with that, but that can create barriers for it. So that if you are, one, it doesn't help you in that a disability check does not help you with that direction, right? It doesn't give you a sense of who you are and what your purpose is. It doesn't help you sort of navigate your life and what your meaning is. It is a check. It is a financial resource. And in some ways, it can be counterproductive in that if you, for instance, I'll just give you one example. If you receive a rating for having a condition and you go through treatment or you get better, you're at risk of that rating going down. And if that rating goes down, this thing that you've come to rely on, anybody comes to rely on, is at risk. And so there can be this incentive that says, don't go too much in the direction of success and completing health treatment and really getting better, because then you might be put in this even more insecure position of, yeah, we're going to cut your benefits some, and that's tragic. I mean, that's not fair to do to people. Now, there are obviously cases where disabilities are so grievous that obviously we have to, as a country, provide compensation. Right? That's what it was designed for. But again, we got to remember that the bulk of these folks are not broken, and we don't need to reinforce that. We need to say, what is your potential, and how do we help reach you there? So I'm not saying that the VA system should be cut at all. I'm saying we need to rethink whether the current means get us the outcomes we want.
This might not be entirely related to your presentation, but just through my own personal research and through friends I have in the Marine Corps, I've noticed there's a significant problem, maybe it's significant, of medical malpractice in the military and the VA. Are there any groups or efforts that you know of that are addressing that problem?
That's a great question. I will answer your very related question with two tangential pieces of information. Both examples of philanthropy. So one of the big struggles that the VA has right now is getting and keeping really highly qualified folks. In part, I'll take nursing as sort of the example for this philanthropist, because there is a national shortage of nurses, and even more of a national shortage of nurses who have expertise in veteran care. And so, you know, it's not entirely surprising that there are shortages at the VA and that there's a lot of turnover because everybody's scrambling for nurses. What this really wonderful family up in New York did, the Jonas family, was say, okay, we have a systemic problem here of too few nurses available overall. At what point in the nurse creation pipeline are we seeing the biggest bottleneck? And so they went to nurses coming out of school and saying, okay, well, they're all sort of graduating at the right rates and they're going into the job market, and it's not that they're quitting nursing, okay? Is it that they're not getting into school in the first place because they're not qualified? No, are they not getting in because there aren't enough spots? Bingo. Well, why aren't there enough spots? Turns out there aren't enough nursing professors in the country to produce the number of nurses for which there is healthcare demand. And so they said, okay, we are going to invest in funding nursing PhDs, which is something that gets so little funding. We're gonna help grow the pool of nurses who can then teach other nurses, so that our one set of scholarships can open the aperture for all of these nursing schools and allow them to let in more qualified folks, so that down the road we'll have more nurses and then we'll have less turnover. So they started this out with nurses in general, and then they noticed a sort of substantial problem within the VA and said, okay, we're gonna specify that some large portion of our nurses focus on veteran research and care. And so now they're producing nursing professors who have a specialty in veteran care and who are also in geographies where there is a particular shortage of nursing. So they're coming up with this very sort of targeted approach to open the pipeline more. So again, that's tangential. The other thing I'll say is some of the medical work being done outside of the VA isn't looking at the VA and playing whistleblower, but what they are doing is providing care and then being transparent about it. So things like I mentioned earlier, the Cohen Veterans Network. Soon the Marcus Foundation has stood up a traumatic brain injury clinic that's really world class. And they're both going to be providing information, and Cohen is already doing this, that's sort of transparent. Here's what we've treated, here are outcomes, here's patient satisfaction levels. And so I think that sort of practice is the kind of thing that encourages everybody to up their game, or it raises the question at least of, hey, if we're seeing it here, why aren't we seeing it over there?
Well, great. This has been fascinating. Let's give our speaker a round of applause.